Hi everyone, welcome to the Faces of Jesus series based on the book of Mark. And today we want to share about the calling of Matthew. Last Sabbath we actually shared how Jesus entered into the house of Matthew for a banquet, but we haven't really shared about the calling of Matthew. And today it is based on Mark chapter 2 verses 13 and 14, how Matthew was called by Jesus. Why is the calling of Matthew eventful? Why is the calling of Matthew spotlighted in the Gospels? Because calling of Matthew could be just a typical calling by Jesus, just like how Jesus calls any other disciples. And in Matthew chapter 5, verses 46 to 47, Jesus preaches his Sermon on the Mount, and he addresses tax collectors as the same as the Gentiles. He does not really mean that tax collectors are the same as the Gentiles, but he wanted to use the thoughts of the people during his time, what the people generally thought of the tax collectors. Moreover, in Matthew chapter 21, verse 31, Jesus mentions of tax collectors one more time, and he says that tax collectors, or he positions tax collectors as the same as the prostitute. So in the gospel, tax collectors are in the same position with the Gentiles and the prostitutes. So if Jesus calls Matthew the tax collector, the position of Jesus will go lower by calling the position of the tax collector. Now, this is what Desire of Ages explains about the calling of Matthew. Here it says in page 273, the calling of Matthew to be one of the Christ disciples excited great indignation. For a religious teacher to choose a publican or tax collector as one of his immediate attendants was an offense against the religious, social, and national customs. So here it mentions of two things. Number one, it was against the national customs, and it was also a great indignation. It provoked anger from people. And our question here is, why did Jesus really call Matthew? Because it's not only Jesus' problem. Even if Jesus is okay with calling Matthew, the real problem is the clan of disciples. The hope of disciple was that Jesus to be the king of Israel, and their constant anxiety, constant fear is that why is the leaders of Jerusalem reject Jesus? But by calling Matthew the tax collector as one of his disciples, the position of Jesus will be even more disadvantageous than to be advantageous. So disciples can understand this, or even disciples will object the calling of Matthew against Jesus. Then why did Jesus really call Matthew? Was this just a typical calling story, or is this a coincidence, or what is this? Because in back to Mark chapter 2 verse 14, here it says that as Jesus walked along, he saw Matthew, and he just called Matthew as his disciples. When we go to Luke 7:29, we see a group of tax collectors, and it says that tax collectors were baptized by John the Baptist. So John the Baptist or the tax collectors already heard the news or the gospel from John the Baptist, and they began to get baptized from John the Baptist. And in fact, a lot of tax collectors already got baptized by John. We do not really know if Matthew was one of them who was baptized by John the Baptist or not. But one thing we know for sure is that there is a rumor, there is a sense in a group of tax collectors that they are also invited to be the part of God's kingdom. Matthew most likely heard about this and most likely knew about this. And this is what Desire of Ages explains a little bit about that. page 272 here says, Matthew had listened to the Savior's teaching as the convicting Spirit of God revealed his sinfulness. He longed to seek help from Christ. So here it says that Matthew actually heard what Jesus taught. Actually Matthew heard about Jesus' preaching, and when he heard it, the Spirit touched his heart, and he realized his sins. He really wanted to seek for help from Jesus. The only problem that he had was that because Jesus already preached Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5, and he already mentioned tax collectors as the same position as the Gentiles, Matthew, even though he really wanted to go to Jesus, most likely he thought that Jesus perhaps will think Matthew as the Gentiles, or even as a prostitute, or even as the traitors or the betrayers of the nation. So for this reason, Matthew could not access Jesus because of fear and because of lack of confidence. And Jesus comes to Matthew because Matthew could not come to Jesus. And in this sense, the calling of Matthew is very significant because no matter of the labels how the tax collector had, no matter how he was regarded by the people, Jesus saw the heart of Matthew, that he wanted to solve the problem of sin by seeking Jesus. And here's the significance of the calling of Matthew. Because Matthew could not come to Jesus because of the circumstance that he had, Jesus comes to Matthew. And in this sense, perhaps we are not very different from Matthew, or we are in the same position as Matthew. We want to access Jesus. We want to solve the problem of sin, and we want to go to Jesus, but there are circumstances that do not allow us to go to Jesus. That might be the busyness of our lives. That might be the culture of the family. Or that might be even the problem of sin, that we are too much addicted to our sin, that we do not have goodness and willingness anymore inside us to access Jesus. Or it might be even that we do not feel the importance of Jesus in our lives. And no matter what the circumstances are, one thing we have in common is that we cannot access Jesus, or we don't access Jesus. And because of that reason, Jesus comes to us. And because Jesus comes to us, all we need to do is we invite Jesus, we allow his righteousness to access our lives. All we need to do is we accept his righteousness. Will you invite Jesus today, who comes to us and who gives satisfaction in our lives?